what you gonna give to me today? Cause you're not feeling good all about you. And what you gonna give to me today? Cause you had a bad day. Well, so did I. So did I, baby. Well, so did I. So did I, baby. Tonight, we're gonna talk about feelings. Tonight, we're gonna talk about all the things that I've always wanted tonight. You're gonna be making up for all the times when I needed you and you were not there. You were not there, yeah.
afternoon, everyone, again. Welcome to this gathering hosted by the Faculty of Humanities, the Department of History and Political Studies here at NMU, the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, and the Center for Philosophy in Africa. So together with the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, they present a seminar on the celebration of Africa Month. I'm Lemogang wa kwa Modisakeng. Ke ana tlou. Ke tlou kholo ya Mmadisanyane ke dumela mokoko. Ngwana wa Thaba tsa Kgotsube le Thotwe. Ngwana wa le Nakana Mofenya Tebele. Ngwana wa Bapo wa Mogale. Pula. Okay. So I've actually discovered through my research that my research is in African philosophy, and I recently discovered that Bapo are actually the Amandebele who speaks Setswana. And I've always had an inkling that I have a little bit of Nguni in me, but I didn't know how. But now I'm like, okay. And I also discovered that Baba are also Abambo, also called Abambo. Abambo at some point migrated to what is now Makanda, what was known as Grahamstown, and then became known as Abafengu. So when I was studying at Rhodes in Grahamstown, I didn't know that I could possibly be on what could be my ancestral land if my tribe of Botswana became Abafengu here in Grahamstown. But anyway, the point is, perhaps in all of our definitions and explanations of what being African means, the golden thread or the most fundamental characteristic is that at some point all of our stories intersect. We're all connected. Okay, so that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, but we're here to talk about more conceptual connections between Africans. And so this engagement draws from 2021's African Governance Report, which called for indigenous knowledge systems and African-based values and ethics to guide continental affairs. The questions central to the discussions are: what should constitute axiological ethics, guiding the implementation of the AFCFA? Will trade liberation help facilitate aspirations of Agenda 2063? For an inclusive growth and development championed by Africans, especially women and youth? And then finally, what should constitute an indigenous epistemic framework that can effectively advance political unity, promote economic integration, and ensure the well-being of ordinary citizens on the continent? So that is what our speakers are here to discuss. First, we're going to have some opening remarks and welcome from Mr. Lutando Jack. Mr. Lutando Jack is currently the Dean of Students at Nelson Mandela University. And then he will be followed by Professor Pamela Maseko, our Dean of Humanities, for introductory remarks. Cool.
Thank you so much, Program Director. Of course, I'm not going to follow on your footsteps in terms of tracing who I am, except to just say there is a connection in terms of the Embo people, because I also belong to that group. So some people get surprised when I say I andingomxhosa, because in terms of our history, Xhosas belong to a particular lineage, of the Nguni people. Program Director, we've started a bit late, so I'm not going to say all the things that I had wanted to say, except to great our co-hosts, the Department of Science, of Sport, Arts and Culture, as represented by the DDG, Sis Mandisa, as well as her entourage. And I would also want to upfront thank the department for having, oh no, sorry. These things can be embarrassing. So you may as well just do likewise. So I would want to thank the department for having agreed to partner with us in hosting this seminar this afternoon, whose theme is really quite apt, critical reflections on the journey we've traversed to build a united, prosperous, and a modernized, whatever that means. I'm sure our speakers will reflect on that, and a modernized Africa. And I would also want to greet the speakers from our sister institutions, from Northwest University, University of Cape Town, as well as Sol Plaatje University. We thank you so much for having agreed to grace us this afternoon to share with us your perspectives in terms of particularly on the theme of or on the sub-theme of the extent to which we have progressed to accelerate as the continent the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. I would also want to thank the Prof. Maseko, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, for, I know that you're going to be embarrassed by what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, for ably leading the Faculty of Humanities on its renewal journey as really a fitting intellectual center, you know, in the bigger journey to reposition Nelson Mandela University as an African university. The type of intellectual vibrancy that you have brought together, working, of course, not working alone, working with the colleagues, you know, in the faculty, is truly noticed. I think we also appreciate the partnership between the Department of Political and Governmental Studies, the Center for Philosophy in Africa, as well as the CANRAD, for partnering, you know, in hosting this seminar. As I've said, I'm not going to say a lot. I had written some few commentary, you know, on the topic, because it is a topic that is quite close, you know, to my heart. Except to just say this seminar takes place within the context of interesting developments, you know, in our geopolitics and in macro economic dynamics. And these are chiefly manifested, particularly by the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, or if you like, by the war between between Russia and the West, depending on where you on where you stand, and how this has an impact in terms of the development of our continent in terms of how we implement the type of programs that we have chosen for ourselves, principally under the rubric of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. For me, I think, and not for the first time, even though as Africans we are always surprised by these events. It was COVID, we were shocked, and now it is this war that I've just spoken about. I'm not sure about the extent to which we are reflecting on the extent to which we are coupled or decoupled from the rest of the world, as the continent. Because now, with the 5 presidents wanting to intervene in this war because of its negative impact on the continent, and yet we've got massive resource endowments that we have not harnessed, to the benefit and to the advantage, of the continent. Because of what I normally refer to as the development path that we have chosen as the continent, which I refer to as path dependence, as opposed to a development path that seeks to create our own development, working, of course, with the rest of the world, as opposed to this over-dependence, to the rest of the world. And I think, again, if you look at COVID lessons, they were quite instructive in this regard, in terms of us being overly coupled, if I may put it that way, to the rest of the world. So I do think that universities like ours have got to reflect on the type of knowledge, type of resources, as well as the type of leadership and the African personality we really need to really accelerate the noble goals of Agenda 2063. And I think this seminar presents us as a university that has positioned itself as an institution committed to the ideals of the continent. It presents us with an opportunity to reflect and to clarify our standpoint, in this regard. But having said all of the above, there is, having gone through Agenda 2063 and many other development plans, of the continent, including our own national development plan, as the country. One question that I've been asking myself is what holds together all these plans? What holds together all these plans? What is the soul of the continent? What is the soul of South Africa? We've always said Ubuntu ought to be that soul, but is it that soul that knits together all these plans, so that indeed we can then say we are on course in cultivating a united, prosperous, and Africa-centered and purposed, modernized continent. So I do hope that perhaps this seminar will help us to reflect on some of those questions. And thank you so much to all of you, for joining us this afternoon. I'm looking forward to what my students normally refer to as an intellectual feast. Thank you so much.
We now welcome Professor Pamela Maseko, who is the Executive Dean of Humanities here at Nelson Mandela University.
Diabolisa? Diabolisa? Niapila? Ndiapila now. I see I'm being greeted outside as well. Good afternoon, colleagues. Program Director Lemohang, Dean of Students, Mr. Lutando Jack, DDG of Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, Ms. Mandisa Chikwatamba, Mr. Rufus Matibe, who is the Director International Relations in the department, Prof. Bridgel from UCT, Associate Professor in the Economics Department at UCT, I hope I got that right, and Dr. Frank Lekaba from Northwest University, and of course, Dr. Dikeledi Mokwena, our own, who are the three people who are going to be anchoring today's conversations. I wish to also acknowledge Mr. Professor Beki Mgomezulu from CANRAD, with whom we are collaborating this afternoon, and Prof. Ntsikelelo Breakfast, the HOD of the Department of Politics, History and Politics, and Prof. Uchenna Okeja, who is the professor in the Center for Philosophy from Africa. And these are the three entities who are collaborating from the university with the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. I also wish to acknowledge guests from the province. I don't know if they've arrived here yet. And of course, the colleagues from the faculty and from outside of the faculty, students, all our guests this evening. A good evening. Before I forget, I wish to acknowledge people from my office, from the Center for Philosophy in Africa, from politics, who worked tirelessly to put this program today in place. So thank you so much, just in case I forget. To make sense of the politics of knowledge representation, one of the leading African philosophers, Professor Mudimbe, coined the term the colonial library as an epistemic framing of a particular idea of Africa. And this still remains a challenge in African universities today. And I'm not going to talk a lot today, also mindful of the time, but I would like us, when we listen today, when we leave today from this conversation, to think about what we are doing as universities, as lecturers and so forth, to either maintain this colonial library or to shift it in a way that challenges us to really make more meaningful contribution in terms of what we imagine Africa to be. So the African Union's Grand Master Plan about Africa challenges the university to imagine the idea of Africa we want to be, around the following goals, and I'm not highlighting all of them. I'm just going to highlight a few. And the goal is to promote and defend African common positions on issues of interest to the continent and its peoples. To promote peace, Prof. Ntsikelelo Breakfast, to promote peace, security, and stability on the continent. To promote democratic principles and institutions, popular participation, and good governance. to promote and protect human and people's rights, to establish the necessary conditions that would enable the continent to play its rightful role in the global economy and in international negotiations. To promote sustainable development in the economy, social and cultural levels, as well as integration of African economies in different aspects of our lives. So I'm skipping quite a few things here that I would have liked to say, but I just want to carry on from what Mr. Lutando Jack said about our responsibility as Nelson Mandela University. I think we have more than any other university in the country articulated in both paper and in the way we do things about what it means to be an African university. We have challenged and offered solutions to some of the things we could do, one of which is the value of the archive in drawing from the past, historical past, and imagining from that archive what is it that we want for an Africa. So, as an African university, we should be playing a crucial role in advancing the goals of the vision of the African Union by serving as a catalyst for education, for research, innovation, and engagement on the continent. And again, as a humanities faculty, where we are positioning ourselves in a way where we want to reinsert the importance of the humanities in all of this, instead of focusing on STEM or technical skills. We're seeing more than ever now the importance of inserting the conversations about the humanities, what they call the soft skills that are missing in how we present negotiations or we argue about issues in the continent. So I just recall the conversation we had, I think again, it was for the last weekend, Mr. Rufus, where we were meeting with one of the subcommittees of your department about the value of the archive in reimagining the African continent. And often when we talk about the archive, we want to present a historical narrative about Africa. The argument that we brought forward in that space is that as universities, we should instead, or in addition, Prof. Mkhize, to providing these historical narratives, what is also important is for us, for Africa to stand and for Africa to be counted amongst the most influential continents in the world. We should be looking at what intellectual histories we can draw from our past and what can the world learn from this history. So the legacy of the continent should not only be on giving an account of what has happened in the past. It should not only be that. It should be on what intellectuality we can learn from, what kind of philosophies we can draw from, and what can we share with the world about this, so that we can expand the idea of Africa beyond that which has been told about Africa by the others. So I want to leave it at that, and then just to add the importance of maintaining these collaborations beyond just these talks. As indicated earlier, we have a collaboration with the department through South African Cultural Observatory, which looks at creative economies. What I would like to challenge the department on is that we are, as an institution, positioning ourselves in collecting the archive around, I think, intellectual histories of African people with a focus on women. We need an infrastructure to be able to do that. Physical infrastructure, technical infrastructure, and so forth. And so I think if we are positioning ourselves as such in the southern African region, I think we need to talk beyond today. It's not to ask for funding today, but it's looking at what strategic partnerships can we learn from this beyond just these conversations. I did indicate earlier on as well that it is not, the faculty does not see, how do I put this, so that the value of these conversations lie in us integrating what we talk about here in the curriculum, in what we teach. So that's why you see the lecturers here. And so we need to have this conversation outside of just the 15 minutes input from the different people here. And so I would like to invite you and your team to the faculty to come and talk to them about the initiatives that you have with the African Union, because that belongs to the classroom and not just in platforms such as this. So I thank you for the collaboration that you've, I know that you've not initiated, but it's continuing, and I hope that it becomes meaningful beyond today. Thank you all, and enjoy the deliberations. Thank you.
We will now welcome Ms. Mandisa Nsikwa Tamba, who is the Director General in the Sports Department of Sports, Arts and Culture.
It's still the afternoon, so ndizoti molweni, ndithi sanibonani, ndithi loshani, ndithi namiddag, because Western Cape is here and Northern Cape is here. On that note, I also want to say before the special greetings, I was counting the representation of provinces here, and I want to say we are cooperating with us representing Gauteng. So lembizo le iphelele, knowing that as well others like Prof. Maseko are not just representing the Eastern Cape, because when their names are called in places like the Northwest, people will say, we know her. So I'm affirming that we are correcting. But on that note, I just want to say special greetings to everyone. By this quorum counting, I'm just saying to my fellow colleagues that are on this program, you are not representing yourselves here. You are representing others in the spaces where you are coming from. So saving time, Prof. Maseko has done it very well for me by naming everyone. You are greeted, and special greetings from the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, and we are happy to be partners with you. We are doing this, and we are continuing to do this whilst we are in that journey. I'm not sure why we keep on landing in the Eastern Cape, because when we launched the Africa Month, we were here in the Eastern Cape, and now we are just about to close the Africa Month, and we are back here in the Eastern Cape. So researchers, you must just find out what is about the Eastern Cape and the Africa Month. Is it about the wars that have been fought here? I think this is one of the spaces where 100 years were once spent, people just fighting, and fighting on this soil, perhaps battles that may not even be battles of their own, like the battle that I will pass through as I speak to you, the Battle of Kotoka Naval. It was happening there, but it was not necessarily a battle of that town. It was just something that was happening there. So on that note, I want to say it is a great pleasure for me to be here amongst you this afternoon, and of course, looking forward to the constructive engagements that are going to take place. And what is more pleasing for me is the audience that I see here, the audience of the young people. And perhaps that is the reason why we could not say no, we are not coming back to the Eastern Cape when we realized who is going to be partnering with us as we are closing the Africa Month. When we realized that it's young people, we said we definitely gonna be coming back. So I want to say on that note, I'm also appreciating those that have sent me here. As I say, we are representing government as a whole, because this program is a program that forms and falls within what we call our National Days program. But there are certain days that are not on our National Days calendar that we felt we cannot just pass by, and we named them our special days. And we added 3 of them to the 6 national days that you know. And we end up celebrating 9 days in our calendar as the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, given the responsibility to coordinate government as a whole in this program. So our presence here, it's also a demonstration, Prof. Maseko, that says we are here to show that you can partner with government. It is possible. So on this Africa Month program, I want to say as well, we have been carrying through a number of festivals. As today we are having a festival of ideas. In other spaces we have been having festivals of just showcasing our cultures, our heritage. And as well, I must say that we've had the opportunity during this month of even showcasing what we call elements of our social reason in terms of sport, as we are seeing ourselves having a number of sport codes that are participating in this country on a level of a number of what I'll call world stage games. So under this theme, deepening the African Union vision for unity, prosperity, peace, and modernity for a better Africa and a better world, we gather here not only to celebrate the milestones achieved by this organization that heralded what we are celebrating, but also to review challenges and chart a way forward. That's why we were appreciating to see that today we are going to have a young audience. And what I like about the audience of young people today is that they speak out of the box. They speak and they are expressive. They research. So I am hopeful that we are going to have a very interesting colloquium. And I must say the colloquium has been as well an integral part of this program. As I say, even where we have been celebrating our culture or our heritage, we have made sure that there are engagements that are taking a form of discussions about our status being as Africa. So the AU, as well, as I said, has always recognized the role of culture, has always recognized the role of sport and art, and seeing these as catalysts of socio-economic development and integration of the African continent. So it is befitting and aligned that we are talking about this within a theme that is talking about Africa free trade, because all these before perhaps they were seen as just subjects that are outside economic development. But today, these are subjects within economic development, because around these, there are commercial opportunities. This year also marks the 35th anniversary of the Battle of Quito-Caneva, as I mentioned, the battle that marked the beginning of the journey towards SADC liberation and South Africa's liberation, in particular, where the liberation forces of MPLA and SWAPO, led by Cuba, defeated the apartheid regime forces on the 28th of March, 1988. So we are here as well to defeat other forces when we are looking at our socio-economic empowerment. And I think it is timing from I don't know where that we are here discussing our socio-economic issues after the recent announcement about repo rates and etc., because it really says we have to ring fence and safeguard our economic instruments as Africans, our economic assets as Africans, and stop being dependent elsewhere, but come together as Africa and find solutions from Africa for African challenges. It is for this reason that I am saying Africa Month is therefore regarded as a platform to promote the AU institution and its programs towards the attainment of the vision, a vision of an integrated, prosperous, peaceful Africa, Africa that is driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. Program director, this program, amongst others, is also aimed at achieving the following: to implement and bring life to AU's agenda of 2063 and the Charter for African Cultural Renaissance, to promote regional integration by strengthening people-to-people contact, harmonize policies, and share skills and expertise. So I want to just pack a bit there and say, when we are signing these agreements as the national department, we are not signing them for us. Actually, recently, I had a discussion with my team in the international relations space, and I was saying what an appetite that is being manifested by the continent and outside the continent to sign agreements with us, the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, not mentioning others. But is it enough for us to sit in these boardrooms, sign the agreements, and scratch our heads to say, what then? How do we implement these agreements? And my message was that we are not signing these agreements for us. We are signing these agreements for others. These are the agreements that we should be showing to you to say, now, here is an agreement with Egypt. Young people, conceptualize the theme around us signing this agreement was this, but it is yours now to find your own appetite in this agreement and conceptualize what makes best meaning to you to be integrated in the spirit of the letter and sentiments in this agreement. So I'm saying, as you moving from departments to departments, knowing people to people contact doesn't start only with us making contacts with other countries. It also starts with us making contact with each other within the country, starting by understanding what government is bringing for us. Moving from departments to departments, your SRCs, your research components should be doing this for you, just putting and pulling it all together, and you form your own programs. I was excited to see, as an example, one young person introduced himself as representing Enactus, and those are the kind of people that should be taking interest in this agreement. So I'm saying we are here to promote economic diplomacy, to promote cultural diplomacy, to broaden the socio-economic agenda, and as well to make sure that they were benefiting from relationships that are established by our government. As we move swiftly towards accelerating the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in different areas, we do so fully aware of taking advantages and making sure that in everything that we are doing, we are doing it, and we are doing it for ourselves and by ourselves. Partnering does not mean waiting for others to do it for you. Program Director, as we appreciate sport as being one of those, amongst others, that I say now it's taking a turn and a corner in terms of its commercial value. I want to say I am making a clarion call to everyone to partake in what we are also celebrating as a country in terms of us hosting the Netball World Cup. The trophy arrived again, another beautiful coincidence in the sense that it landed in this country on the 25th of May when we were celebrating Africa Day. It's taking its rounds, and I think it's coming in the Eastern Cape around about the last week, just before the tournament starts, because it comes to Eastern Cape before it goes to Western Cape, where the tournament would start from the 28th of July up to the 6th of August. So follow the game, and the game is also bringing people, and as I said, people-to-people contacts are essential in our future and in our presence. Towards closing my message, I also want to acknowledge that as much as we are talking celebration, we are not oblivious to the fact that there are still challenges, and of course, some of those challenges are challenges that I think are still relevant for the space in which I am, being in a university campus, when we are talking about issues of xenophobia, because this is the space that should be embracing people from the continent. We ought to find ways of living with one another. Challenges of GBVF, again, those are issues that I know are also confronting you in this space as well. But about all that, I'm mentioning it because it's forming part of our social cohesion programs, and it's forming part of the programs that we should be talking about when we are talking about strengthening our intercontinental relationships. At the end, I am saying I just opening a space for us to think about this and that should form part of our discussions. Feel free, relax, and participate in this program. And I thank everyone who has partnered with us, especially the colleagues all the way from the Northwest, all the way from the Northern Cape, the Western Cape. There's someone I'm looking at all the time, and I wonder, why, Mr. Mgomezulu, I want to say all the way from Mpumalanga. Maybe there is something I see in you that I've seen marked in Mpumalanga. But there you are. And I know as well that being students filling this space and being other partners filling this space, we are also coming from other provinces. So together we stand united. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Thank you so much to our first three speakers. And now I think it's time to get into the panel section of the program. What I will do is I will introduce each speaker, and as I read your bio, may you kindly come on stage and take a seat. And as you give your talk, you can then rise from the seat and come to the podium. Cool. So our first speaker is Dr. Frank Lekaba. Dr. Frank Lekaba is a lecturer of politics and international relations at the Northwest University. He focuses on African politics in areas of peace and security, foreign policies of African states, and relations among African states. He teaches comparative politics, African philosophy, and political development. He teaches both undergraduate and at postgraduate levels, and his keen interest is in the role of civil society organizations in the peace-building process across the continent. Should we call them all up? Okay. And then next is Prof. Pradeep Brijal. Prof. Pradeep Brijal is a South African finance educator, researcher in the fields of business, finance, entrepreneurship, financial management, and investments. His achievements include research in business development services, capital budgeting, entrepreneurship education at secondary and at tertiary levels. Finally, he was a social worker in Cape Town from 1999 to 2009. Okay, finally, Dr. Dikeledi Mokoena. Dr. Mokoena holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pretoria and lectures political economy and decolonial feminism, among other themes. She has been involved in the Pan-African Federalist movement of Southern Africa and served as a global scientific committee member, convening the 60th celebration of All African Peoples Conference. Dikeledi trains and does consultancy facilitation work on youth leadership and governance, Pan-Africanism, feminist leadership, gender, and related topics. Okay, so Dr. Frank Lekaba.
15 minutes. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. 15. Okay, thank you. Sanibonani, good afternoon, dumelang, nda. With that greeting, I hope I've observed all the protocol. DDG, Dinari, Prof. Maseko, you know this word is a buzzword at the Northwest University, Dinari. Yeah, so that Jack, when I say Dinari, I pass the greetings across all the deans. Yeah, and ladies and gentlemen, students, welcome, and thanks to the event organizers for inviting me here on this important talk. Let me start by saying first, Prof. Maseko challenged us to, with the words of our VY Mudimba, I think, Prof, whether are we maintaining the colonial library or are we dismantling it, are we shifting it, are we adding to it, or so on. So my talk, Prof, today, I will not be tapping into the colonial library. I will try to look at what Africans have said in the past with regards to initiatives as this Free Continental Agreement. And there's a body of scholarship that emerges out of the Dar es Salaam School of Thought, where people like Walter Rodney wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. People like Thandika Mkandawire, of course, he comes a little bit later, writing about developmental states. Achima Fejo also belong to the same school of thought. There are many of them, Ibo Mandaza, and stuff like that. So that is the archive that I will be visiting today to make my points. And there are three key questions. I would not repeat them because Lemohang has already said these questions that we, as the panel, have to respond to. But just to say, I will try to respond to the second question, Lemohang. Will trade liberalization help facilitate aspirations of Africa, of Agenda 2063 for inclusive growth and development championed by Africans, especially women and the youth? So the key words here is liberalization. For me, this is a liberalization of free market economies. The role of the state needs to be eroded in terms of economic development. The state must not have a burden of leading the initiatives towards economic development and all of that. And this is not new. In fact, in 1980, the Organization of African Unity came up with what they call Lagos Plan of Action. That was a kind of a first blueprint for the continental development. And as a response to that, this you get from the literature, the World Bank came up with what they called structural adjustment programs. Countries of the continent structurally adjusting their plans, their economic development, the role of the state towards the demands. And they were taken like babies along this process of structural adjustment programs. And liberalization was the key, was the buzzword in 1980. By 1990, all those that subscribed to that structural adjustment programs had not made a headway. They did not make any progress, I want to argue. We can go and look at them today. They have not made some progress. So liberalization, I argue, is not new. And then inclusive growth. I will talk about it later on. I will not touch it here. But the key word that I'm also highlighting in our question here, women and youth. So on the aspect of women, there is a campaign launched, I think last year by the AU. The campaign is What African Women Want. So the campaign takes into cognizance the AU protocols on gender parity and all of that, and it stresses the fact that there must be an emphasis on making gender visible. So, for example, the university will say we have got this representation of women in leadership or representation of women in the university staff component. But what is the representation of women at the management level? What is the representation of women at the lecturer level? What is the representation of women? So this is what the campaign is all about. That don't tell us that you are subscribing to this policy, but give us that clarity, be visible, give us that gender visibility as to how you are advancing all of this. So today I would want to say, as we talk about the agreement, let's stress that agenda, that campaign, as we reflect that the campaign is very important in my opinion. What African Women Want is very important, and it should be a hinge upon which, when we reflect on stuff like the AFC, FTA, we should say, okay, how many women have benefited out of this in the continent? What is the quota of women in terms of, we should be, that gender visibility must be there. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is a little bit complicated now, in my opinion, where, for me, when you read the agreement, states are the motive forces of the implementation of the agreement. They are the ones that, although the regional economic communities must facilitate, SADC, ECOWAS, must facilitate this integration of markets, but they don't integrate markets out of, but the units of integration are states. And yet you are talking about liberalization. So key point I want to highlight here is that the ADB, African Development Bank, estimates growth rates of average 5.5% for the following countries in the year 2023. Cote d'Ivoire, 7.1% growth, Rwanda, 7.9%, Benin, Ethiopia, Tanzania, all estimated to grow at 6.4%. But when you look at these countries, these growth rates are not translated into the Human Development Index. In the same report, the ADB estimates the socio-economic effects of the Russia-Ukraine war, and it says, to a certain extent, this has led to the increase of about 8 million people living under $2 per day in the continent. In the same breath that we are talking about these growth rates, and then there's this increase of millions of people living under the $2 per day, 15 million, about 1.1% of Africa's population, fall under extreme poverty. Increase of undernourished people from an average of 195.5 million to 256.1 million in 2019 and 2021. So these are the challenges that when you talk about this agreement, we have to be cognizant of. That it's not just integration of markets, but it should mean something for Africans. It should mean that this picture that I'm talking about, which is detailed by the ADB, is the ADB report, it's not my report, it highlights all of this. So now, the last point that I want to talk about is the structure, the disjuncture between the growth rates and the levels of development due to the structure of our economies. And now I will focus on the states, because these are the motive forces of the implementation of this agreement. Thandika Mkandawire is very key here when he writes about developmental states. And he says there is two components to the literature on the developmental state. One, that look at the state in terms of the structure, and then that is one part. And then the other part that looks at the state in terms of the ideological role of the state. Should the state play a developmentalist role? Does the state have the developmental agenda? In our case, we have got agenda, National Development Plan, which should be our vision for the development of our country. So Mkandawire says states, the developmental states in the literature, these are the two components that emerge. And on the ideological aspects, states must have what they call a hegemonic project to which the key actors in the nation adhere voluntarily. So when you look at our recent example here, our president, I remember President Mbeki started this discussion about the social compacting, that President Ramaphosa said in 100 days we would have a social compact. All the partners, the economy, business, civil society would have agreed on this, but in 100 days, and there will be a compact. President Mbeki said that has not happened. And in the State of the Nation this year, President Ramaphosa acceded to a certain extent that has not happened, but work is underway. So this then questions the hegemony of the state. Whether is the state capable to mobilize all the actors in the society? Because the state is for all of us. It is what is uniting us, and it is what is holding the monopoly of force over us. It is a tool of social cohesion. It brings us together. For the fact that we said we are South Africans, nine provinces speaking different languages, but we are one, is because we identify with this state, South African state. So it's a tool of social cohesion. Does it have that hegemonic power to mobilize all of us behind the vision of the National Development Plan? When we take an example of the social compacting. So this is what African states must have, according to Mkandawire, for development to take place in the continent. On the structure side of the definition of the developmental state emphasizes the capacity to implement economic policies effectively. So how many economic blueprints have we had since 1994? I want to talk about the continent, but I cannot avoid not to talk about our country. What is the linkage of RDP as GISA, GIPSA, and NDP today? Do we have continuity? Do we have discontinuities, and why? What are those challenges? How are we improving and stuff like that? And then the third aspect Mkandawire says is that undergirding all of these is the autonomy of the state from social forces so that it can use these capacities to devise long-term economic policies unencumbered by claims of myopic private interest. Basically, the state must have relative autonomy, must not be a state that is easy to predatory actors, state capture, among other things. The state must have social anchoring that prevents it from using its autonomy in a predatory manner, enables it to gain adhesion of key social factors. This is the last aspect. The state must, although it is enjoying its relative autonomy, it is mobilizing everybody, but it must have that anchor that keeps it not to be manipulated by any actor in the society. Now, we are emerging out of the pandemic, which has necessitated the role of the state to cushion all from the effects of the pandemic. All of us, and this is my last point, or almost the last, Chair. Everybody came to the realization that the state is important during COVID. Even business community, they saw the importance of having the state. The state bailed out so many business players. There were so many bailouts. We know of the billions the president was announcing. So that, for me, was a realization that this thing that we are talking about of liberalization and the state must stay away and all of that, from free market economies to liberalization and all of that, it's not working. It's not going to work. Because in times of crisis, we run back to the same state. Whether in the United States or wherever, whenever there's a crisis, the state must rescue. But, okay, what kind of crises necessitate the intervention of the state? This poverty that I mentioned is not a crisis that necessitates the role of the state. So we need to rethink this liberalization. In fact, we should not even be talking about it, in my opinion. The last point, Chair, and I will be sitting down now, is that we are talking about building a continental customs union, ultimately, with this agreement. That's the vision. It's there in the agreement, is spelled out. For me, Southern African Customs Union serves as a best model of how that can be done. And it has got three components to it. One is the customs component, where countries like Lesotho, landlocked, they can have imports running in the region and all of that, and there's a clarity on taxation of those customs. So there's a customs component to it, and then there's what you call excise component, and then there's a development component. It has got three components, SACU. And this development component looks at the countries of the region that are members of SACU, Southern African Customs Union, and says the GDP of Lesotho is less than the GDP of South Africa. So when we do the revenue sharing, let us think of this developmental agenda. So this, to a certain extent, will help if we take it as a model of continental-wide development. Will also help us to get to discuss the revenue model, because it's going to be a big issue in the long run, I anticipate. Thank you, Chairperson. I think I'm within my 15 minutes, and I'm open for more discussions. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Prof. Pradeep Bijal.
Sorry, could I have someone to present the slides on the screen? Thank you very much. I don't know much of the African language, so I'll say good afternoon to all of you. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me, especially Prof. Becky. Thank you for inviting me. My topic is going to be varied today. And as I've landed today in PE, I thought of some other topics, and so I'm integrating quite a few topics within my speech today. It's going to include finance, entrepreneurship, youth, whatever that deals with African context. Okay. And I'm also going to maybe give you some figures, I will give you some figures on what has been done currently in terms of research. And I would encourage staff, students also to look at the figures I've given you and maybe build on it and see how we can address these challenges that I want to talk about in my presentation. Okay, so I'll do a quick introduction in terms of the the AFTA. I'll talk about financial literacy, entrepreneurship, and also zoom into women entrepreneurs, which is a hot topic today. And I'll speak about industrialization, beneficiation, and the way forward, okay, in terms of the African context. So just to recap, in terms of the objective of AFCFTA is to significantly boost the intra-Africa trade in value-added production. So the stress is on value-added. We know South Africa or the African continent is a primary industry. We are very good in raw materials, but we cannot add value to it. We have to export it to add value and bring it back into our continent. So this is where the weakness, our lack in skills, is actually one of the problems that's causing us not to so-called progress as the Western continent or countries. So by elimination of trade barriers, it's likely that this will lead to more economic activities which can result in higher tax revenues. And this is to the tune of actually the stock that it can increase up to by 450 billion by the year 2035. And that's going to be about 81% increase in trade, in Africa trade, okay, which means money coming into Africa. So that's a figure stipulated according to research, 450 billion rands by 2035. According to World Bank Report 2022, it recommends building grassroots support, so this is from the bottom up, and understanding of the agreement, simplifying red tape, which is a major problem, especially in South Africa, to encourage investment, and pairing the deal with a complementary agenda. Okay, very important. That includes training and advice for national trade ministries charged with the supervising, compliance, and administration. So there's lots of talk, but no implementation. Okay, so this is where one of our weaknesses lie as well. Right, in terms of financial literacy, I'm sure all of you love money. You're earning money, you know how to spend it. And if you look at South Africa, especially, we are spenders, we're not savers. We've got a culture of spending, which is good in a way because we are supporting the businesses, okay? But if you look at businesses as well, they're not saving to expand, which means if you expand, you're going to create more business opportunities for employment. And you know, South Africa actually has the highest unemployment rate in the world, 32.9%. Okay, if you look at any stats, 32.9%, one of the highest in the world. I'll speak more about youth unemployment soon. So 49% of South Africans are deemed to be financially illiterate, which means they don't know how to manage money. I take a typical example. If you go, if I give someone 100 rands, let's say anyone in the street 100 rands, from experience, the person will go and buy KFC or Nando's. That is whatever the price. But with the 100 rands, you can buy maybe 5 loaves of bread and support your family instead of buying a KFC. So next day, you don't have any money to spend on bread, milk, or whatever, or your bare necessities. Okay, so how do we get in the culture of saving or looking at your cost structure? So when we buy the lowest cost possible so we can spread the so-called goods amongst our family as such. Okay, and we know that in terms of research, we normally spend more than what we actually earn. Okay, which is a fact in South Africa. So 5% of South Africans, actually 3 to 5, the figure is, will be able to retire comfortably. So this puts a lot of pressure in terms of government social support. Okay, so if you're going to be relying on government, we're not going to go a long way in terms of spending. Okay, so we need to actually try to save so that we have become less reliant on the government, and we can actually create more opportunities if you're a business for more so-called employment opportunities. According to so these facts are quite frightening. Okay, I'm not too sure how many of you have so-called saved towards retirement or have retirement annuities. I know you have pension funds at the university or wherever, but in order to top up, you can have RAs. So So you find that the population don't know much about how to save for your retirement, and that's one of the ways to actually save tax. Okay. According to the Financial Literacy and Education Commission, there are 5 key components in the financial literacy. One is earn, spend, save and invest. Does it apply to you? Save and invest? You're not too sure. Borrow? Yes. Protect? Do you protect your investments? We're not too sure, right? So you can answer the question. So this commission is aimed to empower scholars and the working class to make more informed financial decisions at the household and at business levels. Right, according to research by Momentum and UNISA, their report says that youth are overconfident. They think they know too much about finance. But when they actually ran a survey, they found that they scored 36 out of 100. So the score was 36 out of 100. What does it mean? We don't know much about finance, but they think they know about finance. They buy the best shoes, jacket, or whatever. Right. So improving financial literacy is a factor within the control of households and population at large. Okay. So the report encourages households to follow education programs to become financially capable and embrace positive financial behavior. So it's a matter of changing the mindset from a finance point of view. Also, Prof. Bernadine de Klerk, she also mentions that it has to be a joint effort, right? And we're actually far from the actual levels that we're supposed to be at currently in terms of financial literacy. South African households are characterized by high consumption level. And if you look at South Africa, we are a consumption economy. We're not a productive. Productive means whereby we manufacture and we export. Okay, and this is, I think it's about 70% consumption, if my figures are correct. So we need to produce and export, okay? So the reports also suggest that the debt to disposable income is about 73%. What that means, if you are earning 100 Rand disposable income, 73, let's say 100 Rand income, 73 Rand is used to service debt. That's how high in debt we are as South Africans. Right, the research shows that. So if you're going to service debt, how are we going to so-called improve our financial, welfare, or how can we save so that we can retire comfortably? Okay. So recent surveys in South African households reveal that they are under increasing financial pressure. We know that. In the townships, we get loan sharks. Okay, charging interest rate like 50% plus and so on. Okay, so many are struggling to meet the daily needs, and to also basically sustain themselves and sustain their families. So students and graduates from universities also, according to research, seem to lack the awareness of money management, insurance, investments, savings, and spending, and how they can equip themselves with finance knowledge to take charge of the finances in personal decisions. A concern here is from next year, NIFSAS is going to give students the full amount. So that amount will have to be paid to the universities that's coming up. So once a student gets the money in his or her account, he or she has to control the money for the 12 months. So how are you going to spend that money? Okay, that's what I heard from our registrar. Right, so recent surveys, so we need to actually try to educate our students at university as well. I'm not too sure whether you can see that graph on the screen. This is youth unemployment. This is official rate, say about 36, and look at women and the difference between males and females, up to about 37%. But these are just the official rate. The actual rate is actually probably more than 40, 50% unemployment rate in terms of the youth. Okay, so this is from the age group 15 to 24, but if you look from 18 to 34, it's down about 60% plus minus, I would say. Okay, approximately. Unemployed youth. Okay. Coming back to so-called South Africa as a more consumption and Africa continent, we are very rich in so-called primary industry, minerals and so on. So what we normally do is we do not beneficiate, which means take the raw material and so-called process it and transfer it into final product whereby we can use it. Currently, example, let's take metal, scrap metal. even stealing telecom cables or railway cables, what happens? They take the scrap metal, it gets exported abroad, mostly China. So it gets melted in China and comes back as a refined material to the African continent to manufacture cars and so on. So why can't we as Africa get together and refine our own so-called metals, so we don't have to export it and bring it back to the country at high cost? Okay, so you find that the constraints, what are the constraints for that beneficiation? Some of the constraints are countries' labor laws. Okay, each country has different labor laws. The lack of adequate skills, very important. We don't have the actual skills for beneficiation, okay, unless we import the skills. Corruption drive, unstable labor force, lack of research and development, lack of entrepreneurship activity. This is Africa-wide, okay? Inadequate infrastructure and energy problems, okay? Now when it comes to, and also no culture of own creation. Okay, we want to bring things back into, we want final product to be so-called imported. So what are the main factors affecting the South African industry? Okay, these were the factors which I managed to get from research. Labor disputes, okay, very important. Power supply problems, currently Eskom, load shedding. According to the latest report, SARS is actually going to lose 60 billion rands, or so-called lost 60 billion rands in terms of revenue income since load shedding started at the beginning of this year. Imagine 60 billion rands of so-called deficit in terms of revenue collection. So also high levels of household debt, inflation, very high currently, 6.8%. And if you look at interest rates as well, repo rate is now 8.25%, which means prime rate is 11.75%, meaning if you go to the bank, well, you're paying more for your house in terms of your bonds. So we're basically caught in the debt trap as well. So if you're buying a new vehicle, you ought to be paying higher interest rates, car or house, high interest rates. But if you're close to retirement or you're retired, it'll suit you because you're going to get higher returns from your investments. Okay, so there are pros and cons in terms of high interest rates. So who benefits? Pensioners. So the others who got debt, they will not benefit. And looking at South Africa, as I said, 73% debt. So those are the ones I will not benefit. Okay. So we also speak about, so this puts downward pressure in terms of the economy. And does anyone know what's the projected GDP for this year? GDP, World Bank. This is very optimistic, 0.2%. Very optimistic, 0.2. That, I don't think that will happen, okay, considering load shedding. If you look at the population increase in South Africa is about just over 3.2%. So imagine your GDP is so-called 0.2 and your population is increasing above 3%. So there's no match. Okay, so going forward, we're actually going to suffer in terms of our more unemployment because we cannot support the increasing population. Okay, so those are the challenges we have to confront. Coming back to finance, you see, every province can so-called produce or start businesses. And it's incumbent for the so-called municipalities to have certain infrastructures, support for entrepreneurs, support for businesses, like water, electricity. If, for example, in Kalisha, there's a certain area, if you want to start selling some, let's say, takeaway, a spaza shop, you don't have any water services, you know, if you want to sell, wash your goods and services. So you need to support so-called water infrastructure, electricity, so that entrepreneurs can start and run their businesses. So according to research, only 16% of South Africa's 257 municipalities have been given a clean audit. What does that mean? You're given a budget, but you didn't know how to control a budget properly. It wasn't implemented effectively. Maybe you're overspending, or you're supposed to spend, but you didn't spend. Okay, so that's why you find that we're not progressing. Certain municipalities are not progressing. Okay, so so that's a clean audit. Only 16% out of the 257. And this also comes down to education as well, in terms of managers or counselors. According to research, I think it's over 60%, is 62% of counselors only have metric pass. Okay, so which means that they may or may not have financial literacy. So my view is that if you become a counselor or even a politician, you should do something called like a mini MBA, you know, where you deal with finance, how to manage staff, and so on. Simple, you know, just so you have an idea what to do in terms of finances. I come now to entrepreneurs or businesses. So there are various challenges, especially in South Africa, to start your business. Okay, and some of the challenges are deciding what to sell. And again, here we get the opportunistic entrepreneurs and you get the survivalist. So survivalists are one that just want to start business just to support the family. But yeah, we need to move from survivalist to opportunist entrepreneurs, where you grow your business. Right, so what are the challenges? Deciding what product to sell. So we don't do market research. If you're going to start a business, you have to do proper market research. Compliances. What are the infrastructure constraints? Do I have water? Do I have electricity? Marketing. Do I market my business properly? Hiring skilled employees if you're a business, small business. Delegating authority is very important. Okay, we need to delegate authority. Managing time. And the important ones are managing cash and maybe sourcing cash or capital. And also projecting confidence. Now, you know that finance is a lifeblood of any organization, even personal. If you don't know how to manage your finance, you wouldn't know how to profit highly or to maybe grow your business, grow and expand your business. Okay. And if you look at business failures, probably about 60 to 70% will fail in the first 2 years of operation. What's the main reason? Working capital management. Don't know how to control their finances. So if a business starts, maybe in the first couple of months, business is doing very well, I'm getting tens of thousands, let me go buy myself a BMW from the business money. Instead of using the money and going into expanding your business. Okay, so cash. Research done by MasterCard Index of Women Entrepreneurs. Okay, quickly, we just, in terms of research, they found that there was a healthy index in terms of MIW score, but women account for 19.4% of business owners in South Africa. 19.4. If you compare it to Uganda, 39%. So look at the proportion women in terms of businesses. Uganda has the highest in terms of Africa, but close to 40%, whereas South Africa, 20%. We need to catch up with them. In terms of knowledge, assets, and financial access, South Africa, men and women have equal access to funding. So there's no discrimination between women and men if you go for the business loan. So there's also quite a lot of support for SMEs in South Africa as well, by various organizations. So that's an improvement. Okay, right. The way forward, I would say accelerate upskilling. 2, collaborate among individuals, government, education, and the private sector. It has to be a team effort. Okay. Introduce financial literacy to all pupils and to students. It has to start from basic education, right, up to maybe university. And my view is that entrepreneurship should be taught to all tertiary students before graduation. Only about 30 to 40% of graduates will get into a job immediately after graduation. What happens to the 60%? So if you teach entrepreneurship at universities, they have at least an opportunity, awareness of how to start a business. Okay? And we also need to maybe, in terms of Africa now, there's too much of regulations, so we need to maybe have an African Union passport. Okay. In conclusion, we cannot ignore the fact that we are facing a 4th industrial revolution that significantly impacts South Africa, and the rest of the world. If we wish to remain relevant within the global community, we in Africa need to work together and invest in education, training, reskilling, and new skills to cope with the challenges of the future. Thank you.
Dr. Dikeledi Mokoena.
Dumelang, sanibonani. So I am going to just read off from my presentation, and I think there's so many things that Prof has mentioned, particularly with the need to sort of go into the manufacturing sector, right? Invest in that, but then also look in literally focus on our consumption patterns, right? Our consumption choices, particularly if we are to sort of advance this idea of growing economy, supporting Africa. Sort of again the support of this idea of regional integration and advancing African economies. And I think that essentially would, somewhat speak to the choices that we would make in terms of consumption. So my presentation largely, I guess, also then speaks to the conversation and the theme, which is essentially about celebrating and thinking about the African Continental Free Trade area. As our program director mentioned earlier, that this year has been deemed the acceleration of the implementation of AfTA. So in January 2012, the African Union Assembly decided to announce intentions to establish, my mic is like, can I do this? Yes. Intentions to establish the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was meant to create a single market made up of 1.3 billion Africans, which would lead to a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion. According to the World Bank report, the African Continental Free Trade Area is expected to raise wages by 11.2% for women and 9.8% for men. So essentially, AfTA is meant to, be good for women in a sense. So we're expected to celebrate this. But however, in my opinion, I think African feminist political economists should really keep their eye on this, largely because we've known, history has taught us that the integration of women into global economies has largely led or contributed to their precarity, right? So we have integrated women into global economies, but that has largely been at the detriment of women because women have been exploited by international value chain systems. So in that sense, that's something to really be also mindful about. So the logic behind, or rather, the World Bank also claims that AfTA can bring higher paid and better quality jobs. And essentially, the logic behind AfTA was or is to boost intra-African trade, which currently sits at 14.4%, right? So the trade area is also poised to improve Africa's trade deficit in the global market, which currently sits at 50%, or around there in that range. So one of my most favorite objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area is the promotion, or is to promote and attain sustainable and inclusive socio-economic development, gender equality, structural transformation of the various member states that essentially African countries. Oh, my thing is not moving. Hold on, let me move to this one. So on the 21st of March in 2018, there was an agreement that was signed to establish the African Continental Free Trade Area, and this was adopted, and the date of its entry into force was the 30th of May in 2019. So this essentially is also showing us the speed at which this particular program and agreement is actually taking force, right? So this year, the African Union Chair, which is chaired by the Union of Comoros, they had declared that 2023 will be the year of accelerating the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Currently, the African Continental Free Trade Area has operational instruments which include the regime for governing the trade of services and goods under the rules of origin. According to the mutual published by the manual that was published by the Secretariat. The beautiful part is that Secretariat is actually headed by one of our own, a South African. The Secretariat is based in Ghana at the moment. So the rules of origin are a set criteria and conditions used to determine whether or not goods that are traded between African state parties qualify as originating goods. The rules of origin are important because they are geared at ensuring that goods that are liberalized, a problem word that Dr. Frank Lekaba mentioned earlier, actually originate within the African member states. For instance, if you are training, can I have, there's a picture that I just want to have displayed on the screen. And the reason why I want this to be depicted is because this is actually an African car. manufactured by Africans. It's a brand that is owned, manufactured, and designed by Africans, right? So it's Kandaka. I hope that next time when we are chopping money, that we actually will chop money, not necessarily to buy BMWs, but to actually invest in products that are made by Africans. So, for instance, if you're trading Kandaka automobiles, which are cars designed, manufactured, and assembled in Ghana, the tariff concessions will be different when compared to the tariff concessions for like VW cars that we manufacture here in the Eastern Cape, right? So, or rather assembled in the Eastern Cape, because the origins of the parts that are involved will not be the same, right? So this is why the importance of this idea of the manual of the rules of origin come from. So even though Kantanga, a Ghanaian company, has some parts of its products that are important, the imports are not the same as the import parts that we have for VW here, which is based in South Africa. So another example is that the rules of origin would apply differently to Coca-Cola Beverage, a company also we have here in the Eastern Cape, which is based here in Kabeja, and Farmer Brown, right, which is also a company that is based here in Uitenhage. So all of these companies, if they were to trade, right, across the borders, the rules of origin would apply differently to them, irrespective of the fact that they come from the same. And again, there are other, sort of this manual is supposed to assist in determining which actually would get to be able to be exempted from certain taxes, which were mentioned by Prof earlier when he was talking. So, any company trading in goods from the above-mentioned companies will need to be issued rules of origin certificates, which will determine their unique traffic concessions, their unique tariff concessions. And I think this is where largely, again, the idea of the concept of values and ethics and come in, because in the past we have found that there has been a sense of forgeries in terms of certifications, right? So we find that somebody from somewhere would then bring a forged certificate and say, okay, my goods actually would require some concession so that I do not pay tax under SACU. Right, and we know sort of all of these things, and I think there's also that danger that's going to happen with the African Continental Free Trade Area, and unless we actually bring about or think about institutions and ways for us to safeguard against that, we may be in the losing end, and as Africans, particularly on the taxation front. So this is where ethics and governance become pivotal, because in the past, as I've mentioned, ROO certificates have been forged. So we will need an effective certificate validation system, which is going to be essential. And this is also when sort of the role that universities and other teaching institutions will then come in terms of capacitating people in order for us to be able to do this and guard against this. So another regime linked to the implementation of AFTA is tariff concessions. African countries need to adhere to 90% tariff liberalization rule, which means 5 to 10 years, state parties need to eliminate 90% of the existing tariff barriers. And the 5 years applies to non-least developed countries, and the 10 years transition is expected for least developed nations, okay? So this differentiation is crucial because of the various developmental inequalities that we have in the continent and the different concessions for sensitive and non-sensitive goods, which is important because issues such as food security and the need to protect certain infant industries actually become a factor. So most of the products in the sensitive goods category include agricultural products that a lot of us actually consume on a daily basis. The good news shared by a colleague of mine who works at a regional economic community somewhere. So he mentioned that at the particular moment, 43 out of 55 African countries have concluded their trade concessions and actually are ready to implement African Continental Free Trade Area. All right, the countries that are outstanding in terms of submitting their schedules are Djibouti, Eritrea, Sao Tome, Principe, and Western Sahara. Sudan is also in the list, as well as Ethiopia, among other handful, a number of other African countries. The first 5 countries that I mentioned are interested, but are currently being aided in terms of negotiations. Many do not have sufficient capacity to negotiate. Other countries have not submitted their concession schedules because they are embroiled in security related instability, one example being the Central African Republic and Sudan, which are currently dealing with peace and governance challenges. Ethiopia, on the other hand, seems to have its eyes on its European and American trade partnerships, but I'm not sure in terms of what their interests are in terms of integrating within the continent and trading with the continent. So these are some of the challenges that we have to deal with as a continent. So South Africa obviously has been supportive of AfTA, the initiative, but questions that should naturally arise is, are ordinary South Africans poised to benefit from this opportunity? And I think that is actually quite debatable. Will South Africa be integrated into the 1.3 billion market as mere consumers or as owners of the means of production? And again, this somewhat ties up to what Prof was mentioning earlier for the need for us to actually begin to manufacture as opposed to becoming mere consumers, right? Or else the opportunities that we have with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the area, it's actually going to miss us. So we know very well that particularly here in South Africa, the ownership structure of the economy, and let alone the positions of young people and women basically that we occupy in this conundrum, right? So we as Africans have been hasty to partake in this great initiative, I argue, which is basically principally geared at uniting the continent economically, but our unification attempts need to be problematized and will remain problematic. And this goes back to what Dr. Frank was mentioning earlier, particularly when we think about the ideology that is advancing or leading this unification, particularly under the Continental Free Trade Area. So there are other numerous challenges noted about the impediments and the implementation of AfTA, such as existing colonial infrastructure designed to render Africa an export market of raw materials. The destruction of infrastructure in our own country must also be alarming for all of us, especially the implication it has on integration networks within our country. In as much as I support the importance of unifying the African continent, what we must not be blind to is the unification that is not driven by African ideas and value system. And the African Continental Free Trade Area is currently a model of the World Trade Organization, which remains an imperial institution that serves the interests of other nations. So we speak of liberalization of goods, yet our manufacturing sectors across the continent remain underdeveloped, and this has been mentioned already. Investments are pouring into the service sector as opposed to manufacturing. Financialization is shaping our own country's economy at the expense of investment into sectors that will ensure job security and better quality of jobs for everybody. Right? It's not enough to talk about creating jobs, but it's the kind of jobs that matter that we also need to be mindful of. So, in a nutshell, what I'm arguing is Africa is nowhere ready for the unintended consequences that it's going to enjoy and experience as a result of the African Continental Trade Agreement, its implementation. And our lack of readiness will result in the African Continental Free Trade Area happening to us, as opposed to us fundamentally driving it for the prosperity of the African continent. So the African Continental Free Trade, the train, unfortunately, has already begun to move, and it is moving very fast. As I've mentioned earlier, about 43 out of 55 countries are ready to implement, right? It is happening. So what should happen? Right, as we academics debate and conference about the ideologies and other factors linked to our criticism of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Perhaps as we conference about the theoretical frames needed to critically engage the agreement, the African Union, the agreement as well as the African Union, we should also ponder upon solutions and policies that will assist in modeling the African Continental Free Trade Agreement into an inclusive continental project. Perhaps in the interim, young people and women need to organize in ways that will allow them to insert themselves, their services and products within the African continental value chains. We need legislation that will ensure that there is room for the inclusion for the marginalized, and the other thing is to call for the ratification and implementation of the protocol on the free movement of people. Disappointingly, at the moment, the implementation of AfTA is currently not in parallel with the protocol of the free movement of labor. Only business people are considered in the current regime, and that is a problem. We also need to support and anchor existing networks, for instance, cross-border traders, right? So informal cross-border trade has been championing Africa's economic integration. So we know a lot of women actually in the informal sector who have been trading across borders with other people. So this is a phenomenon that is happening. And I think that's where we could also think about sort of tapping into to provide support, right? So Africans have always been trading with one another, leading to cross-cultural influences that exist today. And there's an image that I also would like to have shared there. This one, when I talk about the cross-cultural influences, right? So you see literally how the similarities in terms of the designs, right? So in terms of trade, in terms of the influences with our ideas, particularly cultural ideas, this is somewhat of a common phenomenon. So the trade phenomenon is not something new for us as Africans, right? So hence you see the similarities there that suggest there has always been cross-cultural influences among Africans, which is why we will need to find some design similarities, for instance, between Maasai jewelry and also some of the jewelry that African women design in our own country. So what I'm saying is that informal cross-border trade needs to be anchored with policies that will bolster that particular sector. And one practical thing that we can do as SADC is to consider adopting what the East African community has already been doing. Like, for instance, smaller cross-border traders, particularly there's a special regime that allows anybody who trades or who crosses the border with goods that cost less than $2,000 then they would actually be exempt from some of the barriers for trade, right? And this is something that we don't have in SADC. And COMESA also has a similar regime as well, which applies for goods that are under $3,000. So I think in this instance, as a way of integrating and also making sure that those who are in the informal sector, particularly the art sector, would benefit, that's something that I think SADC should really advance. And I think South Africa was poised to actually advance this at this particular moment. So DGG, as South Africa, especially your department, needs to advance this type of agreement in order to allow ordinary South Africans who are not part of white monopoly capital to somewhat also benefit from this already moving African continental free trade speed train. I relay this responsibility to you, Madam DDGD, because your department's clientele and stakeholders involves artists and women who are who make cultural artifacts which are and can be traded on this huge common market, African market. So while we're on the subject of our stakeholders, we need to also factor the threat that is posed by China's products. Can we have the last slide? So I see some of you, right? So this is like products that you see normally when you walk around somewhere, products that are made by women. So now we are seeing literally China's making the very same products, okay, and then selling them at a cheaper price. So I think also we need to be mindful to really protect our own industries, particularly in this particular regard. So these are some of the dangers, particularly when we are then thinking about the potential corruption that would come in relation to that certificate that's linked to the rules of origin. So if somebody were to forge and say this products actually were made in South Africa when they were not made in South Africa, it will be a problem. So this is where governance also comes in. This is where integrity and ethics, particularly for us as South Africans, but not just South Africans, but Africans all over the continent, right? So it is important that ethics also sort of aligns with our implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So all the other criticisms, particularly the ideological criticisms, the philosophical criticisms, those will be conversations that I think all us in the academy we can have. But for now, I'll just submit this to the department and those who are listening in as some of the solutions that I'm sort of suggesting right now. And thank you very much.
Alrighty, so it's now time for Q&A. I am just going to ask that before you ask a question, just quickly, please state your name, affiliation, and which speaker your question is posed to. Do we have, okay, cool. We already have 2 questions. I note Prof, and then I think we'll take 3 questions per round, so I note the lady.
Hi everyone. I have a question for, my name is Natasha Mhlaba. I'm from Sarah Patman Residence at North Campus. I have a question for the importance of, the role of social media on the overconsumption, especially in the youth, and in contrast, how can we teach the youth about digital literacy, because now we are crossing to that, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. During the pandemic, women especially saw lots of online products. That's via social media. So I don't know whether it's self-learning, and so maybe that's a field maybe to look at for because every teenager or student has a cell phone. So maybe that's one of the means of way to maybe teach them via phones how to maybe market the products via various social media like Facebook and the other social media. I mean, online shopping is an in thing nowadays. You can get something from China, from Japan, whatever. So how do we train them? They have the technology, but we need to teach them the skills in order to maybe market themselves via social media. So I'll say it boils down to training.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Peggy Mgomezulu. I'm the director at CANRAD. I would like all 3 speakers to comment on this one. In 1967, the East African Community was established, but it only lasted for 10 years. 1977, it was no more. And part of the reason was that the Kenyan shilling, Tanzanian shilling, and the Ugandan shilling did not weigh the same. So in other words, currency was one of the major reasons why the East African Community could not survive. The initial one, not the current one that is currently operating. So with that in mind, then I will ask a 2-pronged question. The first part of the question is, given the state of our economies on the African continent, how do you see this Africa Free Trade Area succeeding, given the context I've just presented? That is the first part of the question. Then the second one, which talks directly to the point that Dr. Mkwana was making, is with regards to the juxtapositioning of the AU and the EU. In the main, our African structures cannot survive, partly because they cannot fund themselves. And then they rely on the same erstwhile colonizers to fund them. Now, let me check then from colleagues if we think that this AfCFTA is going to survive, given the fact that some of our countries will be willing to fund it, but will be unable to do so, and then they will end up running to the same people we are trying to run away from. Thanks.
There was a 3rd question, yes.
Hi everyone. So with me, my name is Kagiso from the Department of Sport, Art and Culture. So what I wanted to check now, because I think some few years back there was this campaign of silencing the gun in Africa, and then we were not unable to achieve that. Hence, other countries were unable to sign the AfCFTA. So I wanted to check how will it be possible for all the African countries to benefit from this AfCFTA, because I think in DRC they are still fighting, and then also in Mozambique, Dakabo, if I'm not mistaken, they are still fighting. So how will it be possible for this to be able to be implemented in all the states in Africa? Thank you.
responses?
Yeah, no, I would like to start because I'm on the far, is it the far left or the far right? I don't know. Prof, asking a very tough question that is very pragmatic. One of the things I said when I was presenting here, I said, SACU presents a very interesting case for how this customs union can be developed. In SACU, you know, Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho, they are part of the rent monetary union. So their currencies are kind of pegged to the rent. I don't know if that is a correct language to use, but let's, for now, can I be forgiven for that language? So and then Botswana is a little bit not within the union, but it's part of SACU and all of that. So so I'm saying, the point I'm raising here is that one of the lessons I was saying was that let's look at SACU, how it's functioning. And I remember Jonathan Moyo said, as ministers of finance, they had a strong discussion around after the formation of the government of national unity in Zimbabwe, that let Zimbabwe join this monetary union and use the rand in Zimbabwean economy. And he was saying they were reluctant as Zimbabweans. And the consequences were catastrophic. Because at some point, Zimbabwe was sitting about with 8 currencies. So Zimbabwe was sitting with about 8 currencies, which delegitimized the role of the Reserve Bank or the central bank. You renders it useless, because how do you even manage? How do you target inflation? That's why there was that hyperinflation and stuff like that, and their currency collapsed. So, of course, I'm saying this to also express the point that there's going to be resistance when it comes to integration in terms of the currency. Some countries are going to resist. They're not going to give away their currency just like that because there's Mandela on the... Now you want us to use Mandela here in Zambia? No ways. We have our own Kaunda here. So yeah, Prof, it's a pragmatic issue. I think it's one of the issues that we can take away out of this discussion and to other platforms to say, consider this. But in my opinion, SACU is the best example. It helps. And then silencing the guns. Of course, instabilities are... Look, we have a very strong notion in peace studies that peace is a precondition for development. You cannot have development in the midst of anarchy. And Sudan is a best example. Former Prime Minister Hamdok tried to rally back investment into Sudan. And the military wanted to have its own way, and they ultimately had their way. I remember he was put under house arrest of some sort. He was arrested. In fact, they was reluctant to accept his resignation because he had managed, his stature managed to bring all the investment that they needed in Sudan after the removal of al-Bashir. So silencing the guns, look, these issues of guns that are going off in the continent are a threat to the continental development, not only to the agreement, but to the entire project of development, because they are taking us back, you know. They are taking us back. Ethiopia was growing at the rate of about 6%, and with the war between the Tigray region and the government of Abiy Ahmed hampered the economic growth. So it's not ideal to have peace. But one of the key issues in the continent is that we have embraced the notion of what they call transitional justice, where we say the perpetrators of war are recognized for the sake of peace. And the very same perpetrators of war should be part of the new government that comes in, transitional governments and all of that. It doesn't work. But what is there out there for us to consider? Because an army general in the causing all of this nonsense in the streets, if you don't guarantee him that he might not be arrested, he would not stop what he's doing in the streets. So that is one about transitional justice that to a certain extent helps us to get this stability that we need, and then there will be other justices that will be following. But it's not working because same conflict that broke out in Ethiopia, in DRC, it is all because of these deals. That people who sit on the tables, later on they are threatened, they go back to the bushes. So it's a big problem. Thank you.
Prof, regarding the shillings, at that time it depends whether they were a member of Monetary Union or the European Union. One of the other variables that affects a currency of economy is inflation and the type of goods that you trade. If you're part of the currency union or European Union, you will be under the fixed exchange rate, where you got to move 1% above or below. So you got a certain trade agreement with the investors, financial institutions. You got to work within that band. If you don't work within the band, then you're not part of the agreement. So you may fall apart. And as I mentioned, inflation is one of the factors as well, the type of goods that you import or export. Because with the European Union, you're looking at integration of your goods and services, whereby you try to encourage growth within your membership. And if you don't fall within that, if you fall out of line, then your agreement falls away. So that could be one of the reasons I'm saying, possible reasons why the shilling is different, weighted differently or valued differently. There was also talk of having an Afro currency years ago. Having one currency in Africa, like how you get the dollar. That also wouldn't happen because it depends whether you've got a fixed exchange rate or a flexible exchange rate. If you have a fixed exchange rate, you lose your monetary policy. You got no control over your monetary policy. So certain countries in Africa have no control over the monetary policy. So they've got like a managed or floating exchange rate with the EU or the Americans and so on. So until we get that one, if we lose all those agreements, then we can form one currency. But there's so much of challenges because we all got different goods and services. You know, how do we value the goods and services? Then you have to go back to the gold standards of currency. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like there's really nothing else to add in terms of that. But I think one of the lessons that we could also look at are the existing monetary sort of currencies, right? The currencies in, particularly the one in ECOWAS and the one in, I think, the Central African countries. I think that's also somewhat lessons to learn. Of course, ECOWAS also has its particular challenges with regards to this franc, right? And the French sort of factor in that as well, which is somewhat linked to what the Prof has mentioned right now. But I know they have also been looking at the ECO, right? So there are I think, attempts, and we should not necessarily also divorce ourselves from those attempts, right? So learn the lessons, see what works, improve, and actually come up with what would actually be helpful. And of course, that's where experts then will then come in. Certainly, I think also Dr. Frank mentioned this. Without stability, right? Really, we cannot develop as a continent. And I think the resurgence of unconstitutional changes of government, all these coups that we've been seeing, particularly in the past 2 years, those are a very, very big threat to us. And there is a need for us to really develop, sort of challenge all of that and deal with it, sort of nip it in the bud. But of course, the ability to do that as well is linked to our financial challenges, right? So which then goes back to our capacity, I think it was mentioned by you, so our capacity to also finance all of these projects that we need to get Africa to where it is. And I think for us to be able able to resolve the financial or the funding challenge. There have been ideas that have been shared with regards to how we can raise money as a continent. However, governance issues, institutional issues that we have, sort of that would deal with like problems such as illicit financial outflows. So those are ways that we could actually make sure that our own continent is safeguarded and we are able to raise the funds that we need to do the things that we need to do in the continent.
Alrighty. So I'm going to take a final round of questions so that we can get to the vote of thanks. But before we do, can I just abuse my powers as chair and ask one question? Because I find it interesting that there's a call for indigenous knowledge system constantly, and African-based values and ethics to guide policy and continental affairs. But my question is always which ones, because they're so diverse. For instance, in Setswana we say, "Matlu mabapi, acha mabapi," which means when one house burns, the other one burns as well, which means this house has a moral obligation to help the other one. And when you apply that to geopolitics, you would then say, we have a moral obligation according to Setswana indigenous knowledge systems and values to help neighboring countries when they're in crisis, which is very true because now we have an illegal immigration crisis, which is still not called that, because we haven't helped our neighboring countries. But I'm almost certain that there's another African culture that would say no, to each his own, like deal with your problems there. So how do we choose which African knowledge system to apply and why? Okay, so I note the gentleman in the jacket, I note the gentleman in the hoodie. Yo. I was just going to take 3, but I'll push for 5. Okay, gentleman in the coat, gentleman in the sweater, lady in the yellow top, lady in the head wrap, gentleman with the hoodie. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you very much. My name is Amasa from South Platte University. I will ask a very broad best question related to the question that you have asked, as well as the question that was raised by my colleague, Prof. Mgomezulu. There is a contemporary mantra around globalization, global knowledge economy, and I hear you talk about African ideas to solve African problems. However, critics have often castigated such a mindset as narrow and parochial for African development. What is your comment? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Msinga Ngonya from Nelson Mandela University, doing my final year in Economics, Second Avenue campus. I actually have questions directed to the Deputy Director General and also the Dean of Students, and finally Dr. Mokoena and Dr. Lekaba. So starting with the
We are not panelists.
Yeah, I just wanted to...
Okay, I think we're going to have to limit your question to just one.
Okay, no problems. Okay, to Dr. Lekaba and Dr. Mokoena, the African Union is envisioning the unity, I think, that it sees in the European Union, which brings two factors into consideration: unity and developing in essence. But I want to know, how can we balance those two things? Because I would like to believe that if we are to unify and promote integration in African states, wouldn't that lead into more concentration of people in one side of Africa as compared to people like being in, evenly concentrated all over Africa? And if that's the case, I don't know how I can put this thing, but I just know that if we are to unify Africa, firstly, I just think that there are some African countries that will stand to benefit more than other African countries. But then also at the same point, I think that unity brings development. So how do we balance the two? Which one should come first in terms of promoting and creating a unified Africa?
The lady in the yellow top.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kutlwano Matebe, and I'm actually one of Lemogang Modisa Gang's students, but I come in the capacity of a member of Enactus. So the question I wanted to ask was, well, it's actually rather a comment. I'm quite disappointed by the fact that we haven't really considered new technologies such as big data analysis, artificial intelligence, and blockchain technology in thinking about how we can reframe our e-governance and our policy frameworks. And we haven't really considered what are the ethical considerations in how can we change what it is that we want to change. And another question that I had was, we say that, okay, businesses need financial assistance, but are we sure that businesses are financially literate enough to have financial assistance?
Greeting everyone. My name is Nontobeko Khatebe. I'm one of the SRC representatives. I'll start by acknowledging this program and be grateful that I'm part of it. It's a very good program that should have started maybe the whole of the month throughout all universities or communities. I'm from a deep rural community where I would witness mothers, daughters, and everyone doing business. But instead of their business to prosper, some people from outside, let's say from Department of Arts and Culture, they will partner with them and come to our community and take the resources or the business that we are doing to advance their own businesses instead of teaching them how to prosper their own businesses. Those are one of the challenges that we currently have. For instance, we used to do business work, beadworks. Like they used to host beadwork modeling, which I no longer see anyway. I get to worry a lot that this information doesn't really go out there. There are communities which are already like under mountains, I would say that, because maybe I feel that the government is not able to reach them. I'm from one of those deep communities under mountains. I'm sure no one in this room is familiar with Umkambati. I'm from Mkambatini, Wanyavu, by the way. So I'm trying to actually, I'm too excited. First of all, I'm too excited. I don't even know how to speak right now because I'm getting new information, new programs that I didn't even know about. So we still have a challenge of information not getting to the right places of which where the resources are. I mean the people are. Because I'm speaking of people who are talented, who are able to do things. I can even show you the pictures of the beadworks we used to do with our mothers and sisters in our communities. We still have those things. We cannot even sell them because we do not know where to run to. So we still have those. I would like, it's a request, not a question, for the department, especially the people that are closest to the communities, especially the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, is the one that is closer to the communities, rural communities, to actually invent programs which might take us from these institutions to go and bring back to our own communities the informations that we get here. Thank you.
Molweni. Thank you, Chair, for the wonderful opportunity for us to actually participate. My name is Atengo Sikilane. I'm doing my first year in Master's Maritime Studies in the university. I just want to ask these three questions to the three panelists, or maybe one question
Just
that
one.
cuts across. Yes,
Just
that one that cuts across. Number one, okay, the only question: how do we ideologically unify Africa or the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and how do we protect through militarization the whole process? And just lastly, have we thought about the African diaspora helping finance the development of Africa instead of us getting new presidents that go back to the IMF and the World Bank to seek financing? Can't we approach the African diaspora to help us develop Africa as far as financial assistance is concerned? And just please speak to militarization of Africa in protection of African local economies. That would be my last question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Final question.
Thank you very much. I'm very much tempted to engage, but will do so, because it is very important if you are talking Africa free trade. You can't go to the market if you don't have a product. That's what he's talking about. So we should have this conversation so that there are products that we can take to the market. It talks to the skills development. Otherwise, we'll remain where we are. But my question, straightforward, simple to the panelists, this continent is not, doesn't lack policies or instruments. We have a lot. Since 1963, when the OAU was formed, what is it that stands on our way to implement those beautiful policies that we have? Thank you.
Alrighty, responses?
What is stopping us from implementing? I think maybe the lack of taking responsibility that, one, the African Union is all of us. The African Union is not something over there. The government is not something over there. Whatever it is, actually all of us, we have the responsibility to implement, however we implement in our own work, in our own avenues. And I think the minute we do that, we take ownership of all these policies, because they are about, they are for us, and perhaps maybe that could be a starting point as well. But of course, for us to be able to do that, we, as the DDG mentioned earlier, there are all these agreements, but if people don't know about them, right? So this is where also sort of information sharing then comes in, right? So let it be that we are working for that, towards that. Yeah, so the idea of value systems, I think we've seen how, particularly within the continent, that Africans embrace whatever values actually work and seem to be the best. I think an example would be Ubuntu, right? It's not something that is limited to us. When you move literally across the continent, you will hear even people, other Africans, mention Ubuntu, right, as a principle and as a philosophy. And I think Pan-Africanism, in a sense, in many instances, has, in some instances, been interpreted through that lens. And I think when that's one of the ways. South Africa has largely been doing that as well. When we then consider, particularly in the past, our own foreign policy has been, shaped by this notion of Ubuntu. And then with regards to the diaspora, yes, of course. I mean, but of course that may not be sufficient, but it would be something in terms of addition to the financial or funding crisis that we have. And I think what needs to happen is making sure that there's a reduction of cost of remitting money across from other countries within the continent or into the continent. So, and then with regards to the idea of African problems, that should be resolved with African solutions, and that being linked. I'm not sure if I fully got the question, Prof. But I mean, there have been critique, particularly on that notion of that, the notion that whatever problems we have are African. They're not actually African, they're externally imposed. And I think even with some of the concepts and interventions, for instance, liberalization, this idea of the African continental free trade area, right, is a liberal Western concept. And I think that's something that we should not run away from. So even if it may have an African name, it's not necessarily a solution or an African solution to an imposed external problem that we're currently facing with. So I think the debates and conversations that we'll need to have will sort of don't end here, right? So conceptually, we really need to engage that. And of course, there's one thing that decolonial scholars tend to sort of critique. This article by one of some Latin American scholar. So he says, in the beginning, what was used to justify the imposition of the West or Western ways of doing things into various colonial or colonies is this idea of championing or pushing this idea that people, or for instance with us, right, we were told that we're people without history, people without culture, people without development, right, and etc. All of these things. So there's always something that we lack as a diagnosis, and particularly that diagnosis tend to come from outside. And I think even with this notion of development, we should critique it. So what does it mean? Is it part of a colonial agenda? Does it meet the standards of this idea of importing and imposing ideas around what well-being, if I were to also borrow that concept, what well-being is or what it should be, and should it be done or conducted in ways that meets the standards of those who designed that from outside, right? And then what does it actually mean? So to really for us to go back to, again, indigenous ideas and solutions that would then inform whatever interventions we come up with. Yes, I'll leave the rest to the other panelists.
Okay, I'll just respond to maybe 2 or 3 of the questions regarding the one about bead. I remember I was in Thailand a couple of years ago. There used to be a certain village called OPOP, one product, one village, which means certain village specialize in certain products, and they used to market it to the whichever countries. But it was a very specialized product. And what they did is they got people to train those villagers on how to market themselves. So some intervention of in that case should be maybe some training programs for the informal traders. I can recall I did lots of training for informal traders in Kalisha, Western Cape, those that have no so-called education, went up to maybe grade 7. And just teach them basic business skills, how to do record keeping, how to market yourself. So that's intervention from the university probably is one of the solutions to that. Regarding finance, access to finance and literacy, the banks are only interested in your cash flow. If you've got sufficient cash flow to meet your debt obligation, they're fine. The banks do not look at your profitability. They look at your cash flows. So yes, they don't look at whether you have financial literacy. I know MFIs in Zimbabwe, 1 or 2 MFIs to the farmers, when they give them loans, they ensure that you have to go through a financial literacy program. Do you know how to budget? Do you know how to work out your profit before they will grant you that loan? So that should be also maybe adopted in South Africa. Yeah, but the banks don't have training programs for, for business people, which should be part of the, when you part of the criteria, when you grant loans. The DBSA South Africa, that's an only bank that can fund businesses. So yes, it'll be good to have an African bank. But again, as my colleague mentioned, there's 43 out of 54 that signed some agreement. If we can get together, 54, and get surplus funds and form a bank, that it is possible in the long run. An African bank instead of IMF. So that can be a solution. In terms of policy, yes, we all know implementation. We've got lots of policies in place, but implementation, execution of plans is a major, major problem in South Africa. And also skills. We don't have the skills to implement as well. So we should have something called consequence management, with policies. Here's the implementation, what have you done? If you haven't done, what's the consequences? So maybe look at your supply chain and where does it stop? Where does the buck stop? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think Dikeledi dealt with the question asked by our philosopher, Chair. But just to say, we have to also be mindful of certain philosophical notions in the continent that have been politicized over time. For example, if you go to Madagascar, there's a notion there they call Fihavanana. That notion says you don't talk about our differences to external players. Our differences remain here. So we were doing fieldwork in Madagascar, and one of our key respondents said, "Keep on probing. What is this Fihavanana? You'll see what's going on here." And when we kept on probing, we got some respondents who came very honest to say, no, Fihavanana has got problems. It's problematic. The Marinas, the kingdom of the Marinas has dominated the other kingdoms in Madagascar, subjugated other people in Madagascar. So if you are coming from the coastal, you are not considered to be a true Malagasy, according to. So the Fihavanana hides all of that. So we have to be very careful. And it was the reason why I'm pointing it out. When SADC intervened in Madagascar, SADC suggested that reconciliation should be conducted according to this notion of Fihavanana. So we have to be very careful to a certain extent of these notions, how they come up and all of that. So, Prof, I think that one, narrow and parochial, is they might have really, the person who was saying this, might have really gotten the issue out of context. Because these African solutions to African problems is not a political statement. It is a manner of intervention to African challenges, a thinking on how to address all of this. And you have Professor Mamdani, who has written about Beyond the Nuremberg. And he's writing about what we did here in South Africa, about the truth and reconciliation, as a way to address, because he says what happened in Nuremberg did not address the key issues that were raised there. So he even goes on in one of his books where he talks about the issue in Sudan, how the nation state in Sudan is problematic to address the historical questions in Sudan. So if you don't pay attention to all of this, earlier on, Lemogang, when she was reciting, she said something like Khodifita Matebele. Yes. There is a historical underpinning to this. And Sol Plaatje has written a novel on Mohodi, and he's detailing the battles that went on between Matebele and Barolong in particular. So when you go to Mafikeng and you hear as in Goon, you are referred as Letebil. It's a historical, to a certain extent, has a historical underpinning to it. So when you are a foreigner coming to resolve African problems and you don't have a full appreciation of all of this, then your solutions are not gonna help us with the key issues we are dealing with in the continent. So that is the basis of African solution to African problems. So I think that one of saying it's parochial, narrow, is out of context. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you so much to the panelists for the brilliant responses. So just before we have a vote of thanks, we're going to have a performance by the Natesa Cultural Group, and then Prof. Beki Mgomezulu will give a vote of thanks. Thank you.
njalo and into yethu ayidumanga nje la emazweni. Singabantu nje sasinge wekuthiwa sikhonza umuntu ongushembe kodwa asifihlile singabantwana bakaNazaretha abasuka kwaZulu Natal and ngiyathemba nalento esize kuyona about culture sibuyela ithemba masimenywe indaweni ezikanje bese ngayimisele nangokuza kodwa ngoba bese sibiziwe nje bese sizoza siyabonga kakhulu ngingumntana ke onovalo but ke angifihlanga ngizocela nje noma ivisi elilodwa noma ngingavuma kodwa nje ulihlabelela angiphiwanga nanokuhlabelela kodwa ngizozama nje ulihlabelela amen libongeni bantu nonke Siyabonga inkosi inibusise amen.
Basheshe bayivala kade ngisathi ngizoba joina nami. Angisezokusho ukuthi habari zenu ngoba bekuzofanele ngiqala ngenifundise iSwahili. So I don't have time, so I'll just cut to the chase as it were in the interest of time. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we'll all agree that this event has turned out to be a good one, and we're able to get what we came here for, which is very good for all of us. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for making this event a success. And I thank my colleagues for letting me do the vote of thanks, because I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, started interviews at 5, offended a lot of people. So I used the day to try and calm the nerves so that I could be here. Hopefully, I won't find people waiting for me outside. I thank the program director, who is done a sterling job. Where is she now? Oh, yeah, there she is. Yeah, we done a sterling job. And I also thank all the speakers who have delivered the different pieces of information to assist us. Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much for that. Now that I've extended my vote of thanks then to all the VIPs who are here, I can now thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Maseko and her team for putting this event together. And through her, I would like to thank the Department of History and Political Studies for their sterling job, their indefatigable effort and relentless effort to make sure that this day becomes a success is quite commendable. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to two centers that also formed part of Professor Maseko's team. That is the Center the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, CANRAD, and also the Center for Philosophy in Africa at this university. Thank you very much for your hard work and for making sure that this event becomes a success. My special thanks also go to the National Department of Sport, Arts and Culture. We normally call this department DSAC. For their financial support and also for availing themselves, putting everything aside to be with us to grace this occasion. Thank you very much, colleagues. And as a university, we look forward to collaborating with you in future. Thank you very much for that. I would also like to thank the admin staff and the support staff who worked behind the scenes, attending to all the logistics. These are our unsung heroes and heroines who do a sterling job, but they are rarely recognized for the work that they do. Thank you very much for doing that, colleagues. And I would also like to thank all the service providers who individually and collectively put their heads together to make sure that they deliver on this day and make sure also that they deliver on time. Thank you very much for your work. It didn't go unnoticed. I will then also like to thank you, the audience. There would be no event without you. You have made us proud through your presence, through your contributions, the questions you made, and also the comments as well. And I think you deserve a round of applause. Now, as we disperse after this event, may the spirit of Africa move through your veins, and may today's discussions continue to reverberate in your minds as you ruminate about this day and everything that has happened. We have done a sterling job. Happy Africa Month. Asante sana. Enkosi. Ngiyabonga.
Oh,